I almost canceled the appointment 3 times that morning. 7 months had passed since my wife died, and I still hadn't cleared her safety deposit box at the TD branch on Princess Street. Every time I scheduled it, something would come up, or more honestly, something would feel too heavy, and I'd call my lawyer's office and ask if it could wait another few weeks. It had been waiting since November. My lawyer, who had been patient in the way that good lawyers are when they understand grief is not a scheduling problem, finally told me in early June that the estate administration couldn't move forward. The certificate of appointment was being held up. She needed me to go. So on a Thursday morning, with the kind of flat gray sky that sits over Kingston in early summer before the heat decides what it wants to do, I drove downtown, parked on the street, and walked into the bank like a man who was not entirely sure his legs would carry him through the door. Donna Keene had managed that branch for 12 years. My wife and I had known her the way you know people in a mid-sized city, well enough to ask after her family, well enough that she'd sent a card when Eleanor passed. When she saw me come through the door, she didn't wave from across the lobby the way she usually might have. She came out from behind the service counter directly, and the look on her face was not the cautious sympathy I'd been receiving from everyone for 7 months. It was something else, something careful and prepared. "Gerald," she said, "I'm glad you called ahead. Do you have a few minutes before we go downstairs?" We sat in her office with the glass door closed. She folded her hands on the desk and took a breath. "About 3 weeks ago," she said, "someone came into this branch and attempted to access your wife's safety deposit box. They had a document claiming power of attorney over the estate, but it wasn't properly executed, and the notarization didn't pass our verification process. My assistant flagged it, and they were asked to leave. We documented everything, and I've been waiting to speak with you directly." I asked who it was. She turned her monitor around so I could see the security footage. The image was the standard grainy quality of cameras that record everything and capture nothing cleanly. But I didn't need clarity. I knew that walk. I knew the way he stood with his hands slightly forward when he was uncomfortable, the way his chin dropped when he was trying to seem more confident than he felt. I'd watched that posture develop from boyhood. It was my son, Marcus. I sat in that chair for a long moment. Donna didn't speak. Through the glass, I could see the tellers going about the ordinary business of a Thursday morning, and I thought about how strange it was that the world could look so completely routine from 6 feet away. We went downstairs. She left me with the box in the small private room and pulled the door to. Eleanor had always kept her important things organized. She had a system for everything, labeled files, color-coded folders, a household binder that she updated every January with insurance policies and emergency contacts and account numbers. I teased her about it for 40 years. "You'll thank me someday," she always said. She wasn't wrong about much. The box held our property deed, both our passports, the kids' original birth certificates, a copy of her mother's recipe book she'd had laminated years ago, and a small burgundy envelope tucked underneath everything else with my name written across the front in her handwriting. Not Jerry, which is what she'd called me since our 2nd year of university. My full name, Gerald Thomas Whitmore. The way she wrote on formal documents, the way she signed cards she wanted me to keep. I sat down and opened it. She had written 6 pages on the lined paper she used for her personal journal, the kind she bought in the little shop on Brock Street that sold stationery and local art. The date at the top was 10 weeks before the accident on the 401 that killed her. She wrote that she loved me, and that she was sorry she'd taken so long to put this together, and that she hoped I would understand why she hadn't come to me first. She knew how I felt about my business partner of 22 years. She knew I would want to act before she had enough to show me. She wanted to be certain. Then she told me what she'd found. Eleanor had kept the books for Whitmore and Callister Structural Consulting for the first 8 years of the partnership. When I'd brought my partner in, it was because I had the engineering credentials and the project experience, and he had the client network and the instinct for contracts. We built a consulting practice that served municipal projects, residential developers, and a handful of large commercial builds across eastern Ontario. It was solid, quiet work, the kind that doesn't make you rich but keeps you respected and pays off a mortgage and puts 2 kids through university. Eleanor stepped back from the bookkeeping when our daughter was dealing with a difficult pregnancy in 2017 and needed help. I'd hired an accounting firm out of Ottawa to handle the quarterly reporting. I trusted my partner. I trusted the numbers. What Eleanor found, she wrote, was a second version of those numbers. She hadn't been looking. She'd come into my home office to drop off some mail and noticed a folder on my desk that she didn't recognize. My partner had been over 2 days before to go through some project files, and the folder must have been left behind. She opened it thinking it was something I'd forgotten to file. The letterhead was ours. The figures were not anything she recognized from the reports I'd been sharing with her. She'd put the folder back exactly as she found it and said nothing. Over the following 3 weeks, while I was occupied with a project review up in Belleville, she'd gone back into my home office when I wasn't there and photographed the contents of that folder each time it reappeared. My partner was apparently using my office during his occasional visits to review documents he didn't want going through our main office system. He had a key to our house from years ago. Eleanor had never asked for it back. She hadn't thought she needed to. What those documents showed, as best as she could interpret them without being a forensic accountant, was a parallel invoicing structure running alongside our legitimate billing, subcontractors being charged to client accounts at rates significantly above what was actually paid out, a handful of vendor names that she didn't recognize from 15 years of watching our supplier relationships, and internal approval records showing sign-off on payment releases to those vendors. 2 of those approval records had my son's name on them. Marcus had joined the firm 4 years earlier as a project coordinator. I'd brought him in because he'd finished a business administration degree at Queen's and struggled to find his footing afterward. I thought working with something real, something the family had built, would give him direction. I thought I was doing right by him. Eleanor wrote that she didn't know whether Marcus understood what he was signing. She wrote that she'd been trying to find out before she said anything to me, because she knew that if she came to me uncertain about our son, I would make decisions from a place I shouldn't be making decisions from. She'd been building a record. She'd been planning to take it to our lawyer and to a forensic accountant she'd researched before she sat me down. She wanted to protect me from doing something irreparable before she knew the whole shape of it. 10 weeks after she wrote that letter, she was dead. A highway in October, wet pavement, a transport truck that had drifted, a collision that the OPP report described as a contributory fault accident. I had read that report 4 times and understood almost none of the language, but had accepted what it said because I had no reason not to. I sat in that little room in the basement of the bank for a long time. At the bottom of the box, beneath Eleanor's mother's laminated recipes, was a small USB drive in a white plastic case with a piece of masking tape across it and my name written on the tape in her handwriting. I put it in my shirt pocket. I put the letter in my inside jacket pocket. I thanked Donna Keene at the door, walked back to my car, and sat in the driver's seat for probably 20 minutes without starting the engine. I want to be honest about what those days were like, because they were some of the worst I've experienced, and I've had a difficult few years. I had spent 7 months grieving my wife in the ordinary way that grief works, which is badly, and with no schedule, and in waves you can't predict. I'd started to feel, by June, like I might be finding the beginnings of something like equilibrium. The envelope ended that, because now I was grieving her differently. I was grieving her sitting in my office with her phone out, quietly photographing documents while I was away, carrying something that heavy without telling me because she knew me well enough to know I'd react before I was ready. She had been protecting me, and then she had driven onto the 401 inches October, and she hadn't come home and the protection had stopped. I called my lawyer on the 4th day. I drove to her office on Clergy Street and I put the USB drive and the letter on her desk. She read the letter carefully, twice. She plugged in the drive and went through the photographs slowly. When she looked up, her expression was precise and neutral in the way that experienced lawyers are when they want you to understand they are taking this seriously, without alarming you further. She said we needed a forensic accountant before we did anything else. She had someone she'd worked with before, a man in Toronto who had consulted on a CRA fraud referral in her previous practice. She said we needed to move carefully and quietly, and that I was not to contact my partner, not to change anything in my behavior toward him, not to give him any signal that anything had shifted. She said the same about my son. I asked her about the accident. She held the question for a moment. Then she said that question was one she couldn't answer, and that it was the kind of question that needed a different kind of professional. And she said it clearly enough that I understood she was not dismissing it. I drove home and fed the dog and sat on the back porch until it got dark. The forensic accountant drove down from Toronto on a Tuesday morning. He was methodical and quiet. the kind of man who communicates entirely through precision, and he spent 6 hours with Eleanor's photographs and a laptop and a series of questions. He asked me about our company's billing structure and subcontractor relationships. When he was done, he told me 3 things. The scheme had been running for approximately 5 years. It involved inflated invoicing to clients on at least 9 projects, payments to 6 vendor entities he had preliminary reason to believe were shells, and a billing differential his initial estimate placed somewhere between $800,000 and $1.1 million Canadian dollars. The approval trail was documented in Eleanor's photographs and would require access to the actual company financial system to fully trace, but the pattern was clear enough to take forward. The second thing: my son's name appeared on payment authorization forms for 4 of the vendor accounts. He couldn't determine from documents alone whether Marcus had known the full structure or had been brought in incrementally, but his signature was there in ink. The third thing: our accounting firm in Ottawa had likely missed this through negligence rather than participation. The scheme had been sophisticated enough and spread across enough projects that quarterly summary reporting wouldn't have caught it without someone specifically looking at subcontractor cross-references. My lawyer filed for a court-appointed auditor as part of the estate administration process. My ownership stake in the firm was a significant estate asset, which gave us a procedural basis to request access to the company financials without alerting my partner to what we were actually looking for. My partner agreed to the audit without objection. He had no reason to expect it was anything but routine estate paperwork. The accountant spent 3 weeks in the company system. The final number was $940,000 over 5 years across 11 projects. 7 of the shell vendors had already been dissolved. 1 was still registered in the name of a numbered company that traced back to a holding entity my partner had established through a lawyer in Ottawa. The accountant said the structure was designed to survive exactly the kind of review our Ottawa accounting firm did every quarter, and that it had survived it for 5 years. My son had authorized payment releases to 3 of the shell vendors over a period of about 18 months. Whether he'd understood from the start or been drawn in gradually was something the accountant said would matter in how things were resolved, but not in whether they were resolved. My lawyer referred the file to the RCMP Commercial Crime Unit. There was a contact she'd worked with before who reviewed the accountant's summary and told her they were interested. The file was submitted on a Wednesday afternoon. The week after that, I drove to my son's apartment in the West End. I want to explain why I did this before the investigation concluded. I've thought about it many times since. My honest answer is that I needed to see him before everything collapsed. Not to give him a warning he could use to run, because what was moving was already moving and I had no hand on it anymore. But I needed one conversation that wasn't mediated by lawyers and investigators and whatever processes were coming. I needed to see my son's face. He opened the door in his weekend clothes and knew immediately that something was wrong. He always had his mother's instinct for reading a room before he walked into it. I asked if I could come in. We sat at his kitchen table. I didn't speak for a while. He waited. That surprised me. The son I'd raised would have filled any silence with words. This one waited. I told him I'd been to the bank. I told him about the letter. I told him about the accountant and the lawyer and the RCMP file. I told him I wasn't there to threaten him or negotiate with him. I just needed to know one thing. Did he understand, when he first signed those forms, what he was actually signing? He looked at his hands for a long time. Then he looked at me. He said no. He said my partner had told him the vendor accounts were part of a cost management structure that operated outside the standard billing for what he described as GST optimization purposes. He said he'd known it was unusual. He said my partner was the senior partner and he'd trusted him the way you trust someone who's been at your family's table since you were 11 years old. He said that about 3 months in, he'd started to understand that it wasn't what he'd been told, and that when he'd tried to raise it with my partner had made very clear what would happen to Marcus if he tried to extricate himself. He'd been carrying that for almost 2 years, he said. He hadn't known his mother had found anything. I believed him. I believed him not because it made the situation simpler, and not because I needed to in order to love him. I believed him because he had always been a genuinely poor liar since he was a small child, and because when I said his mother's name, the look that crossed his face was one I recognized from my own mirror every morning. I told him what was coming. I told him he needed a lawyer immediately, and a good one. Then I told him I loved him, and I drove home. The RCMP made their move on a Friday. My partner was contacted at his office on a fraud investigation. A financial crimes team began working through the company records under a production order. By the time my lawyer called to tell me it had started, it was already done. My partner had apparently asked 3 times to call his lawyer before anyone had finished the first sentence. I won't tell you it felt the way justice is supposed to feel in films. There was no moment I'd been building toward. No scene where I stood across from someone and said the thing that closes the chapter. What I felt was tired, in a way that goes deeper than sleep has ever reached. And underneath the tired, something very quiet that might have been the beginning of relief. My daughter drove in from Vancouver the following week. She took 2 weeks off work and came with no agenda beyond being present. She helped me go through the last of Eleanor's things in the bedroom, which I hadn't been able to touch. She cooked. She sat on the porch with me in the evenings and didn't try to reframe anything or offer the kind of perspective that people offer when they want grief to move along more conveniently. She understood when to speak and when just to sit. She got that from her mother. The financial recovery process was slow and partial. My partner's personal assets were subject to a restraint order pending the proceedings. A civil claim ran alongside the criminal matter. The full $940,000 would likely never come back in its entirety. But my lawyer believed a significant portion was recoverable, and the civil process was proceeding in that direction. My accountant advised me to treat anything recovered as unexpected rather than expected, so that I made decisions about the firm's future from a realistic baseline. The partnership was dissolved through the legal process. My engineering credentials and licenses had always been in my name, and the client relationships that were genuinely ours had been built on the quality of our work rather than on my partner's salesmanship. I brought in a project manager I'd worked with on a municipal contract in Napanee a few years back, a woman I'd trusted for a decade, and I scaled the practice down to a size I could oversee directly. Smaller projects, municipalities I knew personally. The kind of work I'd been doing before the firm grew into something that required me to trust other people's reporting without verifying it myself. My son cooperated fully with the investigators. His lawyer negotiated an agreement that included financial restitution from his own pocket and a period of conditions that amounted to a supervised resolution outside the criminal courts. He didn't face a conviction. I know some people who hear that will have feelings about it. I've made my own peace. He's working in a different sector now, away from construction and finance entirely, and we speak most Sundays. It's careful and slow in the way that anything has to be when it's being rebuilt from scratch rather than simply maintained. But it's real, and it's honest in a way that I don't think our relationship was before, because we were never really tested before. The OPP file on Eleanor's accident was reviewed by a collision reconstructionist retained through my lawyer's office, a retired officer who had spent 20 years working traffic fatalities. He went through the original accident report and the scene photographs and the transport truck driver's statement, and came back with a written summary that described 3 elements of the scene he would have examined more carefully, had he been the primary investigator. He described these elements as inconclusive, but worth formal review. My lawyer forwarded his findings to the OPP. I can't tell you that produced a clean answer. The investigation was reopened on a limited basis. The last update I received from my lawyer was that it remained open and that timelines on these matters were difficult to predict. I've had to arrive at a kind of peace with uncertainty that I did not previously understand was a thing you could actually achieve. Some threads stay loose. Some questions never close in a way that gives you the word you're looking for. I've had to learn to live alongside them rather than wait for them to resolve. What I can tell you clearly is this. My wife spent the last weeks of her life photographing documents in my home office with her phone while I was away for work, quietly and methodically, building a case she intended to hand to professionals before she ever brought it to me. She did this because she knew me. She knew I would react from emotion rather than strategy if she came to me with a suspicion instead of a certainty. She protected me from myself, the same way she had been protecting me from myself in smaller ways for 40 years, and I hadn't always known enough to see it. I think about her sitting at my desk in the late afternoon light that comes through the east window, going through that folder, photographing page after page, setting everything back exactly as it was, going downstairs to make dinner without a word. Not out of deception, out of love. Out of a determination to get it right before she handed it to me, because she knew that what I built over 30 years mattered to me, and she wasn't going to let it be quietly drained away without doing something about it. That was who she was. I knew it in the way you know something you see every day, which is to say, not sharply enough. I'm 64 years old. When my partner built that structure, I believe part of his calculation included me, an older partner in the winding down years of a career, one who had handed the detailed accounting to an outside firm and stopped cross-referencing the numbers himself because the firm was stable and the projects were moving and comfort had quietly replaced attention, one whose wife had stepped back from the books, one whose son was there every day and who could be brought into the arrangement in a way that made it harder to unravel without damaging the family. That calculation was wrong, but I have to be honest about why it was close to right. I had let trust become a replacement for oversight. I had done what people do when something they built stabilizes. I pulled back from the details and told myself that delegating was the same as maintaining. I let a 30-year friendship give my partner a level of access to my professional life that I had never paused to examine. I handed my son a job and a future without watching closely enough what he was doing with the responsibility that future required. What Eleanor was trying to give me, in those photographs and in that letter, was the chance to correct all of it before it was too late to correct anything. She ran out of time before she could give it to me herself. She gave it to the box instead. She trusted that eventually I would show up. I kept the letter. It's in the top drawer of my desk, not in a folder, not filed away. I read it when I need to remember what careful love looks like when it is doing its hardest work, quietly and without recognition. Every time I get to the end and see the way she signed it, the way she always signed the birthday cards she slipped into my coat pocket every year on the same morning so I'd find them on the way to work, I feel the full weight of what I lost and the full weight of what she left me at the same time. I've changed how I run the practice. I review the financial statements line by line every month. I know every subcontractor by name, and I verify every invoice against the work order before it moves through the system. I ask questions that I used to assume I already knew the answers to. I have a standing call with my accountant on the last Tuesday of every month, not because things are going wrong, but because attention is not something you can store up and draw on later. It has to be continuous. The safety deposit box is closed now. I have no reason to go back to it. Everything that was in it is either filed in my home office, worn on my daughter's hand, or sitting in my desk drawer where I can reach it without looking. I'm paying attention now. To the books, to the people I work with, to the reasons I trust what I trust. It's not the way I expected to learn this at 64, but it's what I have, and I intend to keep it.